The content on the Unitales channel is protected by copyright. Unauthorized use may result in legal liability. My morning began, as always, at 6. The sound of the alarm clock pierced the silence of our cozy suburban home, where I had lived for the past 15 years with Emma, my wife. Lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling for a few seconds, illuminated by the light of a street lamp outside, trying to gather my thoughts. Today was just another ordinary weekday, one of hundreds in my life. Emma was still asleep, her chestnut hair splayed across the pillow, while our cat Sylvia dozed in the corner of the bedroom, curled up on her favorite chair. Everything looked so familiar, so peaceful, that I found myself smiling for a moment. My life was organized down to the smallest detail. At 51, I had a stable job as a manager at a small IT company, a salary sufficient for an annual vacation by the ocean, and an adult son, Nate, who had recently graduated from college. Each morning, I ran a couple of kilometers through the park and then enjoyed breakfast in silence while Emma continued to rest. Our life always seemed harmonious to me, even if it lacked the storms and passions of the early years of our marriage. The house we lived in was on a quiet street, a classic American suburb with perfectly trimmed lawns, neighbors who greeted each other in the morning, and the smell of fresh baking on weekends. My old Chevrolet Silverado sat in the garage, and on the kitchen table awaited me a fresh newspaper and a mug of coffee brewed by the machine. Everything looked like a scene from a postcard. Emma worked as an administrator at an art gallery, which added a touch of aesthetics to our life. She often brought home stories about new exhibits, the people she interacted with, and occasionally even artwork, reproductions, of course. Her taste and attention to detail brought coziness to our home. Books lined the living room shelves, and her favorite watercolors adorned the walls. But behind this perfect picture, a strange undertone had begun to emerge. It all started about a year ago when Emma suddenly changed. Not in a dramatic way, but in subtle, almost imperceptible ways that only someone who has lived beside her for many years would notice. She began staying late at work more often, spending time on phone calls that hadn't been there before. There were new perfumes, new dresses. It seemed as though she was trying to regain some of the vibrancy that had faded over the years. At first, I suspected nothing. A man often explains changes in his wife's behavior with anything but suspicion. However, I couldn't shake a strange feeling, not anxiety, but something deeper, as though a storm was gathering on the horizon. Everything changed that night when I found her phone lying on the kitchen table. I had woken up in the middle of the night, my mouth dry. Lying in the darkness, I felt my parched throat begging for even a sip of water. Carefully, so as not to wake Emma, I slipped out from under the covers and put on my robe. The house was silent, with only the faint whisper of the wind outside the window. Descending to the kitchen, I turned on the small night light by the stove to avoid being blinded by the bright overhead light. I opened the fridge, grabbed a bottle of water, and took a few large gulps. Just as I was about to turn off the light and head back to bed, I heard the vibration of Emma's phone on the table. Her phone was charging, the screen glowing as a message popped up. I wasn't planning to read it. Really, I wasn't. But the screen lingered on for too long to ignore. The message was from her colleague, Karen. They had been friends for several years, and I had never thought of Karen as someone capable of causing any trouble. But the text was odd. Next time, don't forget to bring that toy. It was amazing. I froze. Toy? Amazing? My mind instantly flooded with thoughts, each one worse than the last. What toy? What could this even mean? My brain scrambled to find a rational explanation. Maybe it was some sort of weird joke. Or perhaps something about the gallery exhibition. I wanted to convince myself that it was all trivial, nothing to worry about. But a wave of unease began to rise in my chest. I looked at the staircase leading upstairs, where Emma was still asleep. My heart was pounding as if I had caught someone in the act of committing a crime. I sat down at the kitchen table, pressing the bottle of water against my lips. There was no point in calling Karen or waking Emma. You're overreacting, I tried to reassure myself. But those words in my head didn't chase away the cold feeling inside. When I returned to bed, I tossed and turned for a long time, listening to the soft sound of Emma's breathing. Questions swirled in my mind. What toy? What was amazing about it? It felt like a tiny puzzle with a crucial piece missing. I didn't fall asleep until early morning, but waking up the next day brought no relief. On the contrary, it felt as though the first crack in the structure of my familiar life had widened. Something was definitely wrong. The morning started with the same routine as always. The smell of freshly brewed coffee, the rustling of newspaper pages I was flipping through more for show than for reading, and the sound of Emma's footsteps in the kitchen. She seemed calm, her usual self, dressed in a robe, her hair tied up in a bun. Nothing appeared out of the ordinary. I silently watched her pour herself a cup of coffee, raising it to her lips. My heart was racing faster than it should. I decided to ask her a question. I already had a plan in mind. I'd bring it up with a touch of irony, so she wouldn't realize how deeply the message from last night had unsettled me. I began, trying to keep my voice steady. You left your phone on the kitchen table last night. She looked up at me, her hands still holding the cup. Really? It's surprising I even forgot it, she said with a small laugh. There was a message from Karen. Something about a toy. I tried to say it casually, as though I were recounting a joke. What kind of jokes are you two sharing? Emma froze for a brief moment, but then burst into laughter, as though I had just told the funniest story in the world. Oh, God, you mean that? She set her cup down and shook her head, still smiling. It's just our work slang. We call new installations at the gallery toys. You know Karen, she's always joking around. We sometimes tease each other like that. She waved her hand dismissively, as if closing the subject, and picked up her cup again. So, don't worry, nothing unusual, she added with a light smile. I nodded, though something in her response left a faint scratch on my thoughts. Perhaps it was how quickly she came up with an explanation, or maybe it was the way she laughed. Too loud, as if trying to drown out my lingering doubts. Got it, I said, forcing a smile. It just seemed a little strange. Oh, darling, she said, taking a sip. You're just overthinking things. Maybe you should relax. Everything is fine. She shifted the conversation to something else, talking about weekend plans and how she needed to stop by the gallery. I tried to follow along, but a subtle itch of discomfort lingered inside me. I knew her too well. That laugh wasn't quite the same as usual. It was just a bit louder, a bit more strained. It carried a faint note of tension, one that perhaps only 20 years of marriage could make noticeable. But maybe I really was overreacting? Maybe I was just looking for problems where there were none? With these thoughts, I went for my morning run, hoping to clear my head. But instead of clarity, one thought kept spinning in my mind. What if she lied? Months passed, and those strange nighttime doubts gradually faded into the background. Work was in full swing, and the new project I was working on demanded my complete attention. Long days at the office, meetings with clients, and fine-tuning details took up so much of my time and energy that I barely had space left for personal reflection. Emma was busy too. Her work at the gallery had become especially hectic in recent months. She often talked at dinner about upcoming exhibitions, new artists, and the challenges of organization. I listened, not really absorbing much because honestly my mind was preoccupied with my own problems. One evening, as we sat in the kitchen with cups of tea, Emma glanced at me, a hint of nervousness in her expression. You know, I'll need to go away for a week, she said, pretending to focus on slicing a lemon. We have an exhibition in another city. Karen and I are being sent there to organize everything. It's a big opportunity for the gallery, and I think I should go. I broke away from my thoughts and looked at her. Her face was calm, but I noticed a faint sparkle in her eyes, perhaps from excitement or anticipation. Of course, I replied, shrugging. If it's important for your work, why not? Yes, it really is important, she smiled, quickly adding, Karen and I will take care of everything. It's a great opportunity for the gallery to gain recognition. I nodded, deciding there was no point in digging into the details. After all, it was just a business trip, nothing unusual. Emma often went on trips like this, and I had always trusted her. When are you leaving? I asked, taking a sip of tea. Sunday morning. We'll be there until the following Saturday. All right. I hope everything goes smoothly, I said, trying to sound sincere, though deep inside, that old sense of unease stirred again. Emma smiled at me and took my hand. Her gesture felt warm and genuine, or so I thought. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that a shadow had passed between us. The following week passed in our usual rhythm. I was consumed by my project, and Emma was busy packing, occasionally calling Karen to discuss exhibition details. Everything seemed normal. But on the evening before her departure, as I helped her pack, I found myself watching her movements too closely. She appeared calm, but overly focused. Each item was packed with precision. Her movements deliberate, almost mechanical. "You're not forgetting anything, are you?" I asked jokingly, trying to lighten the mood. "I don't think so," she replied without looking up. "Although, I'll double-check in the morning. Better safe than sorry." The next morning, I drove her to the airport. She hugged me, kissed my cheek, and said she would miss me. I watched her disappear through the terminal doors and felt a faint prickling in my chest. Maybe it was just fatigue, or was something genuinely wrong? Throughout the day, I tried to distract myself from the strange thoughts by immersing myself in work. But in the evening, when I returned home, I noticed her laptop still sitting on the living room table. It was a small thing, insignificant really, but for some reason, it stopped me in my tracks. I stood there, staring at it, unsure of what to do. I tried to brush away the odd thoughts, but Emma's laptop, left behind on the table, seemed to call out to me. It was a minor oversight, easily explained by the rush of leaving. Initially, I just intended to move it to her office, but at some point, curiosity got the better of me. I opened the laptop, and the screen lit up immediately. It took only a few seconds to realize she had enabled synchronization with her phone account. Notifications, recent activity, and even the device's location were displayed on the screen. A map popped up, showing her current coordinates. Why not? I thought, feeling a strange mix of anxiety and excitement flare up inside me. I clicked on the map and zoomed in. Her location matched what she had told me, a hotel in the city center near the exhibition venue. Over the next day, I checked the map occasionally. Every marker corroborated her story. She stayed at the hotel, attended the exhibition, and returned afterward. The route made sense, with no deviations. Nothing seemed suspicious. On the contrary, everything pointed to me wasting my time, staring at a digital map, trying to find cracks where none existed. But even after these checks, I didn't feel completely at ease. Why was I even doing this? This wasn't like me. Perhaps it was work stress, or perhaps some part of me was still searching for something amiss. On the third day of her trip, I forced myself to close the laptop. Watching her location made me feel not only ridiculous but also dirty, like I was invading her privacy. She had always been honest with me, so why was I behaving like this? I tried to distract myself, put on a movie, poured a glass of wine. But the feeling that something was being hidden between us would not go away. Maybe it was my imagination, or maybe it was just the lingering effect of that message from months ago. But for now, the facts said one thing. Emma was where she was supposed to be and doing exactly what she had told me. Everything appeared perfectly normal. Emma returned on Saturday evening, just as dusk was settling in. I met her at the front door, helping her bring in her suitcase. She looked refreshed, with a faint tan on her face, as if the week had been more of a vacation than work. Her eyes sparkled as she immediately wrapped her arms around me, pulling me close. "I missed you so much," she whispered, and I caught the floral scent of her hair. "You can't imagine how exhausting it was without you." I smiled, hugging her back. "Well, now you're home. Did everything go well?" "Yes, the exhibition was amazing." "Want me to tell you all about it?" she asked, tilting her head up, then laughed. "Actually, you know what? I'll tell you later. Right now, there's only one thing I want you." Before I could respond, she tugged at my hand, leading me upstairs to our bedroom. Her urgency surprised me, but also filled me with a quiet sense of satisfaction. Our relationship had always been passionate. The physical side of our marriage had never been in question. Her intentions were clear, direct, and I was more than happy to respond. That night reminded me of the early years of our marriage, when passion burned brightly, and we could forget the world when we were alone. Emma was tender and assertive at the same time, as if trying to make up for the week she had been away. At some point, I couldn't help but feel that everything about this moment was a little more intense than usual. It was as if she were trying to prove something to me, or maybe even to herself. Afterward, we lay side by side, her head resting on my chest. I stroked her hair while she remained quiet, simply listening to the rhythm of my breathing. "Everything went well?" I asked softly, not entirely sure what I meant by the question. "Everything was wonderful," she replied without lifting her head. "And now it's even better." I wanted to believe her, and for a moment I truly did. The morning began with the usual routine. Emma quickly gathered her things and headed to the office, saying she needed to report on the exhibition and wrap up a few tasks. I stayed home, feeling unusually relaxed. My long-awaited project had been completed the day before, and for the first time in ages, I allowed myself the luxury of staying in bed a little longer. But the lazy morning was interrupted when I felt a strange discomfort. At first, I ignored it, assuming I had simply slept in an awkward position. However, when I finally got up to go to the bathroom, a sharp, burning pain shot through me so intensely that I cried out involuntarily. It felt like a searing sting, as if my body were rebelling against something as routine as this. I leaned against the wall, trying to make sense of what was happening. The pain was unbearable, and even the thought of it subsiding on its own seemed absurd. After a few minutes, I gathered my strength, grabbed my phone, and called a clinic to schedule an emergency appointment. "Hold on, sir, and come in as soon as possible," said the woman on the other end, her tone steady but concerned. As I got ready to leave the house, I thought about how Emma always cared about my health. She would have insisted that I see a doctor immediately. With that thought in mind, I got in the car and drove to the nearest clinic. In the reception area, I was met by a doctor, a young man with a confident voice and a focused demeanor. After I described my symptoms, he frowned and quickly sent me for tests and an ultrasound. "This could be an infection or something more serious," he said when I returned to his office with the results. Sitting on the stiff chair across from the doctor, I felt anxiety washing over me in waves. Something in his tone made me uneasy. "Have you had any invasive procedures recently?" he suddenly asked, looking at me intently. "No," I replied, shaking my head in confusion. "Why are you asking?" The doctor closed the folder with the results and folded his hands on the desk. "You have signs of a urinary tract infection, and I suspect the cause might be unusual. You should talk to your partner. These infections are sometimes transmitted sexually." The doctor's words felt distant, as though someone was speaking to me through a glass wall. My head buzzed, and my heart began to race. An infection? Sexually transmitted? I couldn't find a suitable response. After all, there was only Emma in my life. When I left the clinic with a prescription for antibiotics, a dark shadow of doubt began to grow inside me. I wanted to believe it was just a coincidence, a fluke, but the thought that it could be something else planted itself firmly in my mind. Returning home from the clinic, I felt utterly defeated. The doctor had said it would take a few days to get the final test results, so I decided not to say anything to Emma for now. I needed to figure things out for myself first. At home, I tried to calm down, lying on the couch and flipping through TV channels. But my thoughts refused to let go. I found myself revisiting details of her recent behavior. The subtle detachment before her trip, her unusual passion that night after she returned, her laughter masking a strange tension. All of it seemed to form a pattern I had been refusing to see. After a couple of hours, I couldn't take it anymore. Getting up from the couch, I went to our bedroom and approached her suitcase, which was still standing against the wall. She clearly hadn't unpacked it after returning. I justified my actions by telling myself I just wanted to make sure everything was in order. But deep down, I knew I was looking for evidence of something that terrified me. The suitcase was a standard one with a combination lock, which, fortunately, was already unlocked. I opened it and began going through its contents. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary. Clothes, a makeup bag, a couple of notebooks related to her work. But something about the structure of the suitcase caught my attention. The bottom was slightly thicker than usual. I lifted the edges of the interior lining and, to my surprise, discovered a hidden compartment. My heart began to pound. This wasn't something you'd find in standard suitcase models. Carefully, As if expecting the suitcase to explode, I opened the false bottom. What I found inside made me recoil. It was an entire collection of intimate items, vibrators, handcuffs, strange accessories whose purpose I couldn't even guess. They were neatly arranged, as if someone had taken great care to conceal them. I felt a wave of anger and disgust rise within me. At first, I didn't know how to react. These items could mean anything. Perhaps she had bought them out of curiosity. But then why hide them in a secret compartment? Why take them on a business trip? My imagination began to run wild. I tried to come up with an innocent explanation for this discovery, but each version crumbled under the weight of common sense. Deep down, I already knew the answer, but I refused to accept it. I closed the suitcase, carefully putting everything back as it was, and sat on the bed. My head was spinning, and my hands were trembling. I wanted to call her and demand an explanation. But instead, I decided to wait for her return. 2 hours later, the doctor called. His words echoed in my mind. "You have gonorrhea at the very least. The other results will be ready in a couple of days." I couldn't believe this was happening to me. Everything was falling into place. My recent pain, Emma's strange behavior, her secrecy. She had cheated on me. She had betrayed me. Despite the storm of emotions, anger, disgust, disappointment, I decided not to confront her just yet. I needed to stay calm. I wanted to uncover the full truth before confronting her. When I found her phone, it was lying on the nightstand in the bedroom, almost mocking me. I knew the password. It was the same combination as her suitcase. Her trust in me had once been as strong as my trust in her. I entered the code, and the screen unlocked. At first, I didn't know what to look for, but my intuition led me to her messages. In one of the chats with Karen, her friend and colleague, I stumbled upon something that left me stunned. They were openly discussing their health issues. The messages were blunt and unfiltered. "Karen, are you sure Josh is the only one? I thought he was so careful. My God, if I'd known, I wouldn't have agreed to this. Emma, he said he didn't know. How could he mess up like that? We've already taken a massive dose of antibiotics. I hope it's enough. Karen, what about the husbands? Are you sure they won't get sick? Emma, I think it'll be fine. The main thing is that no one finds out. If questions arise, we can always say it's from the pool or something like that. You know how it goes." I sat there, thunderstruck. They knew. They knew they might infect us. They took measures for themselves but said nothing, didn't warn us. The main thing is that no one finds out. That phrase struck right at my heart. But I had already fallen ill. The anger that had been simmering inside me now flared up like a wildfire. She hadn't just betrayed me. She had knowingly put my health at risk while protecting herself. I took screenshots of the conversation and saved them. Now I had evidence. But instead of exploding with rage and confronting her immediately, I realized I needed to act strategically. She probably didn't suspect that I knew anything, and that could work in my favor. In that moment, when I understood how far my wife had strayed from the bounds of our marriage, my fury transformed into cold calculation. I decided to play the role of the unsuspecting husband, hiding my suspicions until I could gather all possible evidence. Her betrayal was so deep that I no longer felt the need to confront her right away. Now I needed to understand the full extent of it. I hired a private investigator, a middle-aged man with a calm voice and a serious approach. He specialized in handling delicate matters like this, promising confidentiality and professionalism. We met at a cafe out of town, where he asked me a few questions about what exactly I wanted to uncover. I need to know everything about her infidelity. When, where, I said, try to keep the tremor out of my voice. Rest assured, he replied calmly, making notes in his notebook. I'll have a full report for you in a week. During that week, I continued to act normal around Emma. I smiled at breakfast, discussed weekend plans with her, and even pretended to be happy about her upcoming trip to another gallery meeting. She suspected nothing, her behavior as calm and composed as ever. A week later, the detective called me, and we met again in the same cafe. This time, he arrived with a folder and got straight to the point. I've uncovered some interesting details, he began, pulling out photographs and reports. Your wife and her friend have managed to turn their hobbies into an entire system. He paused, studying my reaction. I remained silent, clenching my fists under the table. They participate in what's known as a private interest club. It's an informal group that organizes group sexual encounters. These usually take place in rented houses or at exclusive events. The participants include their colleagues, your boss, and several other men from their social circle. How many men? I asked, my voice cold as ice. Sometimes up to 8 at a single gathering, he replied, lowering his voice slightly. They have a system. Everything is organized. They schedule their meetings in advance. To them, it seems like a game. No one is coerced. It's all consensual. He pulled out several photographs and laid them in front of me. The images showed Emma and Karen in the company of several men. Their faces were obscured by masks, but I recognized Emma instantly. These were taken at one of their meetings. I won't go into graphic details, but you can see what's happening. I stared at the photographs, nausea rising within me. All my worst fears had been confirmed. This wasn't a one-off incident, not a mistake. It was a lifestyle she had deliberately hidden from me. Thank you, I said curtly, taking the folder and tucking it away. The detective looked at me with a hint of sympathy, but said nothing. He had witnessed such scenes dozens of times. For him, it was just work, but for me, it was the destruction of everything I had considered my life. Now, I had not only evidence, but also a clear understanding of what I needed to do. Emma couldn't even imagine that I knew the truth. And I decided to use that to my advantage. The realization that my wife had turned our marriage into a theater of deception obliterated any remaining affection or trust. I resolved that she would have no chance at an easy life after everything she had done. But I had to act coldly and methodically. The first step was our joint retirement account. For more than 20 years, Emma and I had been putting money into it. It was our safety net, our shared plan for the future. But now, it was clear to me, she would have no claim to that money. Not a cent. I sat down on my laptop, logged into online banking, and accessed our retirement account. The amount was significant. Every time I had looked at those numbers in the past, I felt proud that, as a family, we were prepared for old age. Now, I saw it only as a tool, one she would never use again. Over the next few days, I began transferring the money to my personal account. I did it in small amounts to avoid raising suspicion. Emma rarely checked our financial balances, trusting me entirely in that regard. Ironically, her trust became my greatest weapon. Each transfer felt like a blow to the life we supposedly built together. With every transaction, I felt myself regaining control. It was the first step toward destroying her illusion of a perfect marriage. At the same time, I began gathering all financial documents, contracts, policies, and records of joint assets. I had no intention of leaving her with anything but memories of how she lost it all. Throughout it all, I maintained a calm facade. In the mornings, I smiled at her over coffee, engaged in conversations about her work and future plans. She suspected nothing. At some point, I realized I was playing my role better than ever before. Every evening, after she went to bed, I stayed in my office, planning my next steps. Financial destruction was only the beginning. I knew I wanted to take down not just her, but also her interest club. All those degenerates, including her boss and their friends, would have to answer for their actions. Their lives were already starting to crumble, even if they didn't know it yet. I continued transferring money from our retirement account in small increments, ensuring everything went smoothly. Within a couple of weeks, the majority of the funds had been moved to my personal account. The remainder, I allocated to a new investment portfolio opened in my name. Emma had no idea that her future was already unraveling. Meanwhile, I focused on my next move. I hired the same detective to gather more detailed information on all the members of the club. He provided me with a list of names, photographs, and connections, including addresses, phone numbers, and other personal details. Among them were her boss, a few influential businessmen, and a couple of lawyers. These people were used to their dirty secrets remaining in the shadows. But this time, the shadow was far too thin. I devised a plan. I needed to ensure that each of them faced the consequences of their actions, but my involvement couldn't be traced back to me. I started with Emma's boss. Through contacts, I discovered that he had repeatedly hidden income and used his position to secure contracts through bribery. I anonymously sent this information to the tax authorities. Next were other participants. One of them, a restaurant chain owner, was involved in under-the-table payments to employees and income concealment. I arranged for their financial records to end up in the hands of auditors. Another, a well-known lawyer, received anonymous photos showing him at one of the orgies, with a threat to leak them online unless he resigned from his position. Every step I took was calculated and executed without haste. These people began to realize someone knew about their dirty games, but they had no clue who was behind it all. As for Emma, I continued to play the role of a loving husband. She suspected nothing, chatting about work, her friend Karen, and occasionally mentioning upcoming exhibitions. I acted as though everything was fine, and there was a chilling irony in that. One evening over dinner, I even asked her how she envisioned our future, as if testing how deeply she was entangled in her lies. Emma smiled and said, "I think we still have plenty of surprises for each other. You know how much I love you." Her words sounded almost sincere, but now I knew the truth. She didn't love me. She loved the convenience of the life I had built for her. My revenge was gaining momentum, and I was ready to see it through to the end. All that was left was to wait for the moment when her world would start collapsing before her eyes. My thirst for vengeance kept growing. I didn't just want these people to face the consequences of their actions. I wanted their lives to be irreversibly destroyed. Financial and social blows were not enough. I wanted to take away what they believed made them men. I decided to start with Emma's boss, the man who not only organized these gatherings, but also used his position to manipulate and pressure others. My detective provided me with all the information I needed about his schedule, routes, and habits. This allowed me to craft the perfect plan. I found the right people through old connections, several tough, reliable guys who knew how to act decisively, but without unnecessary noise. I paid them in advance, promising the rest upon completion of the task. We discussed every detail to ensure the operation went smoothly. First, I arranged for the purchase of a stolen car. The vehicle was chosen to avoid attracting attention. Old but functional, with unreadable plates. I ensured it was registered under the name of a third party, a small-time criminal who had already caught the attention of the police. This added another layer of protection for me. We mapped out the boss' route and daily routines. He drove home at roughly the same time every day, taking a quiet road on the outskirts of the city. It was the perfect spot for an ambush, few witnesses, and almost no police presence. That evening, as usual, Emma's boss left work in his luxurious car. His route took him down the narrow, dimly lit street. The men I hired were waiting for him there, with the stolen car parked to block the road. When he approached and stopped, likely preparing to get out and see what was going on, one of my men suddenly emerged from hiding and struck the windshield with a heavy bat. The glass cracked, but didn't shatter, and the boss immediately recoiled, instinctively trying to shield himself. Before he could process what was happening, the second man yanked him out of the car. They acted quickly and efficiently, as though they had rehearsed this scene countless times. There was no one else in the car, which made the task easier. They threw him to the ground, pinning his arms behind his back. The boss tried to scream, but one of them clamped a hand over his mouth. "You think you can live your filthy life without consequences, huh?" One of the men hissed, raising the bat above his head. The blows started landing on his ribs, legs, and shoulders. This wasn't random violence. Each strike was calculated to inflict maximum pain while avoiding fatal injury. The boss writhed and gasped, but his attempts to fight back were pathetic. The focus shifted to his groin. One of the men swung the bat with force, striking his genitals. The boss let out a scream, so piercing it could have been heard across half the city, had the street not been deserted. Another man stepped forward and viciously stomped on his groin with heavy boots, methodically crushing what remained. His screams turned into guttural gasps. By the time they were done, his pelvic bone was broken, and his genitals had been reduced to a bloody pulp. Before leaving, they searched him, taking his phone and wallet to make it look like a robbery. They left his car, now damaged and bloodstained, at the scene. The attackers fled in the stolen vehicle, which they later burned in a forest to eliminate evidence. The next morning, I saw the news. Emma's boss had been found on the side of the road, bleeding profusely. He was rushed to the hospital, but the doctors couldn't save his manhood. From that moment on, he was a broken, humiliated man. For him, this was just the beginning. I knew that ahead of him lay financial and social ruin, and now the physical impossibility of continuing his filthy deeds. I did not feel a shred of regret. He was just the first of many. When it came to the lawyer's turn, the plan was crafted with even greater precision. His house, located in an upscale neighborhood, was hidden behind a high fence and a dense hedge. However, his overconfidence became his downfall. He rarely used his alarm system and almost never hired security, believing no one would dare to threaten him. My men waited for him late one evening when he returned home from work. They watched until the lights in the house went out and then carefully entered through a ground floor window. Everything was arranged to avoid noise and unnecessary attention. The lawyer was asleep in his bedroom when they woke him. One of the men pinned him down, covering his mouth to prevent him from screaming. Another tied his hands tightly behind his back with a sturdy plastic zip tie, leaving him unable to resist. "Stay calm. This is just punishment for your sins," one of them whispered into his ear, dragging him toward a chair in the corner of the room. They sat him down and stuffed a thick gag into his mouth to muffle his cries. His eyes darted around in fear and rage as he mumbled incomprehensibly, but no one paid him any attention. Everything was planned in advance. One of the men brought out an iron, already plugged in and heated to its maximum temperature. They took their time, as if this were an ordinary, routine task. The lawyer's breathing grew erratic as the iron heated up. The men watched him without a hint of emotion. When the iron was scorching hot, one of them slowly brought it close to the lawyer's groin, stopping just short of contact to let him feel the heat. The man tried to scream, but the gag muffled the sound. "You thought you could get away with everything, didn't you?" one of the men said with a cold smirk. "You destroyed lives, and now you'll know what that feels like." Then the iron was pressed against him. The lawyer arched his back in agony, his face contorted in excruciating pain, but only muffled sounds emerged from his throat. They didn't rush, holding the iron just long enough to inflict maximum pain without killing him. When it was over, they left him in his home, half alive, broken, and with a clear message that this was no random attack. Someone would find him in the morning, and the entire world would know about his humiliation. It was meant to be both a punishment and a warning to the others involved. My men left as quietly as they had arrived, leaving no trace that could connect them to me. This wasn't just revenge, it was a statement. The lawyer would never return to his former life. His reputation, status, and physical state were utterly destroyed. As for me, I felt like I had taken another step toward justice. But there was still no peace inside me. This revenge had become my obsession, and I knew I wouldn't stop until I had dealt with every last one of them. This time, the targets were two of Emma's boss's partners, owners of a large factory. These men saw themselves as untouchable, enriching themselves through worker exploitation, tax evasion, and participation in their club's dirty schemes. They needed to be punished in a way that symbolized their complete humiliation and served as a warning to anyone who thought they were above the law and morality. My men began by studying the partners' routines. They frequently met in the factory's conference room after work hours, discussing financial manipulations and new opportunities. The men suggested striking there. The factory was far from the city, and at night, it was practically deserted. The operation was set for a night when both partners were scheduled to stay late. My men infiltrated the premises through the warehouse area, using a prearranged truck to avoid suspicion. The two partners were seated at a long table in the conference room, deep in discussion, when my men burst in. Their faces were hidden by masks, and rubber batons were in their hands. Two swift strikes to the back of their heads were enough to bring the men to the floor. "This is just business," one of my men said coldly as he tied the victim's hands and feet with sturdy plastic zip ties. They were dragged out of the conference room, through a dark corridor, and straight into the heart of the factory, a workshop housing massive presses used for metalworking. These machines emitted loud, ominous noises even when powered off, making the workshop the perfect place for their punishment. The men were separated and seated on 2 work tables, bound tightly so they couldn't move. Their eyes were filled with terror mixed with humiliation. One of the owners, desperately trying to assert his significance, shouted, "You have no idea who you're messing with. They'll find you and crush you." "Find us?" "Maybe," one of the men replied with a smirk, "but not before we're done." They pulled out a specialized device, a small press designed for testing the durability of metal components. Its original purpose was to apply immense force to metal pieces. Tonight, however, its use had changed. The first man was forced to watch as the machine was prepped, the tension in the air palpable. His face turned ashen as he realized what awaited him. None of the attackers said a word. They simply watched their work with cold detachment. They started by using the mechanism to slowly compress sensitive parts of the victim's body. The pain was excruciating, but neither man could scream. Their mouths were stuffed with gags. The air grew hotter, the metal heated up, and the men thrashed their bound limbs against the steel tables in vain. When the act was complete, the 2 were left lying unconscious, fully aware their lives would never be the same. They had lost not only their manhood, but also any remnants of their self-assured arrogance. Every step they took from now on would remind them of that night. My men vanished as quickly as they had arrived, leaving behind only the traces of mechanical retribution. The factory remained intact, but its owners were broken. By morning, when the workers arrived, they would find their bosses and understand that their power and influence had become things of the past. For me, this was another step toward justice, albeit in a form I had chosen myself. But with every act, I realized more and more that this revenge was no longer just retribution. It was becoming something much larger, an obsession. The preparation for the final stage of my revenge was the most difficult and meticulous part of my plan. I knew there would be no turning back this time. My goal was not only to destroy the world Emma and her accomplices had built, but also to leave her with nothing, alone, humiliated, and lost. To achieve this, I needed to disappear without a trace and prepare the ground so thoroughly that she could never find me or reclaim anything she had lost. I started with the complete transfer of all assets. The remaining funds in our joint accounts were carefully funneled into offshore accounts through a chain of shell companies registered in countries with ironclad financial privacy laws. To execute this, I hired a lawyer who specialized in such operations. He knew how to obscure the trail so thoroughly that even the most determined auditors wouldn't be able to follow it. "Everything will be ready in a week," the lawyer told me during our meeting at a small cafe, handing me documents to sign. "The accounts will be set up under new names. The money will be untouchable by anyone but you." I ensured that every transaction was conducted cautiously, in small amounts, to avoid drawing attention. By the time the process was complete, our joint accounts were left with mere pennies. Emma would only discover this if she decided to check the balance, but she trusted me too much to do that. I knew that to disappear completely, I would need new documents. Through my connections, I found a reliable specialist who helped me acquire a passport, driver's license, and social security number under a new name. The documents were indistinguishable from the real thing, allowing me to use them anywhere without risk. When I received them, I felt a strange sense of relief. The face in the mirror was the same, but the name on the passport now belonged to an entirely different person. It was a step toward freedom. The next step was to find a place where I could start fresh. I chose a country where I had no friends or acquaintances, Australia. There, no one knew me, and the laws were strict enough to protect my anonymity. I contacted a real estate agent and purchased a small house on the oceanfront through the same offshore company managing my money. My move had to be as discreet as possible. I started getting rid of things that could link me to my former life. Old photographs, documents, letters, I either burned them or threw them away. The only thing I kept were a few pictures of our son. He was the only bright spot in this dark story, and I couldn't completely sever my connection with him. Before disappearing, I continued to play the role of the loving husband. I laughed at Emma's jokes, discussed plans for the future with her, even bought her a gift, a beautiful pendant she had wanted for a long time. She suspected nothing, thinking everything was perfect between us. This was the final act of my performance. On the day I left everything in place. The breakfast we had together seemed ordinary, even dull, to her. I left the house under the pretext of work, got into my car, and never returned. By the time Emma realizes what happened, it will be too late. All the money will be gone, the accounts zeroed, the property sold. She will be left alone, surrounded by debts and memories of the life I destroyed. For me, it was the end. For her, the beginning of a new, empty existence. I had done everything to restore justice. But as I looked out of the plane window on my way to a new life, I suddenly realized that I didn't feel any lighter inside. The revenge was complete, but its taste was bitter. The plane landed in Sydney early in the morning. A light breeze, smelling of the sea, and the cries of seagulls greeted me as I stepped out of the airport. Australia seemed like the perfect place for a new life. No one knew me here, and my past was thousands of kilometers behind, like a broken bridge that I had deliberately burned. I got into the rental car and headed to my new home, a small wooden cottage by the coast, bought through a shell offshore company. The road was empty, and everything around me looked like it came from a postcard. Endless fields, blue sky, and the ocean sparkling on the horizon. The house greeted me with silence. It was small, with an open veranda offering a view of the ocean. Inside, everything was simple but cozy. Wooden furniture, an old fireplace, a kitchen that smelled of freshness. I unpacked a few things I managed to bring with me and opened the windows to let in the sea breeze. Sitting on the veranda with a cup of hot coffee, I looked out at the distance. Where the ocean met the sky, I felt a strange peace. For the first time in months, no one was watching me, no one was waiting for a trick. This was freedom, the kind I had longed for. Meanwhile, Emma, completely unaware, was living her ordinary life. She went to work, thinking about evening plans, maybe dinner at her favorite restaurant, a conversation about where we would go on our next vacation. But strange things began happening at the office. She tried to log into our banking app to transfer money for the rental of her work car. The app displayed a message, insufficient funds. Emma frowned, thinking it was a mistake, and called the bank. "Sorry, Mrs." The operator stammered, "but the balance of your account is zero. Funds have been transferred in several transactions to an offshore account. We cannot provide more information." "What?" she screamed, not caring that her colleagues could hear her. "This can't be. Check again." But the check confirmed what I had planned. Her dreams of security and a peaceful old age were shattered in minutes. She dialed my number, but all she heard was a busy tone. "The subscriber is unavailable." When she returned home, everything looked as though I had just stepped out for a moment. My cup sat on the table, my jacket hung on the chair. But the more she searched for traces of my life, the clearer it became. I was gone. For good. She discovered the zeroed-out accounts, the empty safe deposit boxes at the bank, and the absence of documents for the house and car. Everything we had built together was destroyed. The house, which now belonged to an offshore company, was awaiting new owners. In shock, she tried calling friends, but no one could help. And then she found a note. It was the only thing I had left. "You got what you deserved. This is not punishment. This is retribution. Live with it." Emma sat at the kitchen table in our empty house, staring at the note, trying to comprehend how her world had collapsed overnight. Her friends from the club were destroyed. Her reputation was shattered, and now she was left with nothing. At that moment, I knew she felt the same way I did when I learned of her betrayal. At my new place, I settled in as no one, a man without a past. The local fishing community welcomed me warmly, and no one asked too many questions. I began working at the pier, helping to unload boats. It was simple work, but it brought satisfaction. Sometimes, sitting on the veranda, I thought about the past, about what I had done. Was it revenge, or simply a way to erase everything and start fresh? Maybe both. I no longer kept track of Emma. Her life was left behind, like an old book that I closed forever. Now I had only one task, to learn to live with myself, with the silence that came every night along with the ocean breeze. The end.